Welcome to video 10, where we're going to look into the theory behind ratio analysis. I'm going to use an analogy to demonstrate what the intent is behind ratio analysis. So I've picked two well-known athletes, and one of them is Usain Bolt, and the other is Haile Gebrselassie. Now, how would we know that Usain Bolt is a high-performing athlete? Well, there's some obvious indicators. One, he has won multiple Olympic gold medals and world championships. And he's supposedly, in his heyday, the fastest man over 100 meters. And that was measured simply by timing him over that distance from a start point to an end point. Now, Usain Bolt has some very particular characteristics when you look at the man that might suggest that he is a high-performing athlete in his specialist event. He's tall, he's muscular, he's slim, and those are good indicators of someone who's probably can run quite fast. And if you looked at him, you would say, sure, he's a high-performing athlete. There are also some indicators under the surface that you can't see that might relate to his blood pressure or his resting heart rate or his glucose levels. And there might also be indicators that he is a high-performing athlete. So there's no doubt about his abilities. But look at him next to another man like Haile Gebrselassie, whose speciality is the 10,000 meter. So obviously he's a more long distance runner, and when you look at his physique, he's a far smaller, leaner man. He has the characteristics that relate to long distance running rather than sprint training or sprint running, which definitely require a certain level of muscular fitness that Haile Gebrselassie doesn't necessarily have. So what this represents is two men, high-performing athletes in their field, but they have different characteristics that describe them, but those characteristics are really important for their speciality. So if we were to look at some perhaps well-known South African businesses, where we've got Shoprite being in the retail sector, Vodacom in telecoms, Mr. Price in clothing retail, and Wilson Bailey Homes in the construction business, you would expect for these different businesses there are different characteristics that describe whether they are high performing or not. And that is definitely true. For example, in a business like Shoprite, you're going to find that the profit margins are very low. So therefore, operational efficiencies are critical in this business, perhaps more critical than in some other businesses. And maybe because there are very low profit margins, you will find typically retailers don't have large amounts of debt on their balance sheet. But a company like Vodacom, which has a high capex requirement in order to grow, typically has more debt on the balance sheet. And those are just one or two characteristics that I'm picking out here. So that really just sets the scene in terms of the ratio analysis. And really what we're doing is we're looking under the surface of a business to find out the performance drivers, and we want to uncover the variables that drive the performance. What I'm going to do in the following slides is I am going to explore three areas of ratio analysis that are important no matter the company. And those areas are what I'm referring to here in this slide as profitability, activity, and leverage. Now, if we can just get to terms with how those three drivers or those three indicators help us understand performance, we are well on our way doing some really good ratio analysis. So let's jump into this. This is a layout that by now you should be familiar with, our income statement and our balance sheet. And here I'm going to show you some profitability ratios and I'm going to start off with the gross profit percentage. So here you see I'm measuring the gross profit divided by the sales, and you can see exactly where those are in the income statement to get a gross profit percentage. So that's quite straightforward. Going down a step lower in the income statement, here we're taking the operating profit, or EBIT, or profit before tax as we've referred to it, and we're dividing it by sales. We're going to multiply it by 100 to convert it into a percentage, and we've got the operating profit percentage. And then we're going to go down one step further, all the way down to profit after tax, also measured as a percentage of sales. And what we've got from this is three very simple calculations, all with the same denominator, being the sales in the business, telling us what proportions of profits there are at these different levels. So that's a good starting point. Let's move on to the activity measures. So here in activity, what we're trying to find out is how efficiently, if you want, is the business using the net assets. And just look at the two numbers that I'm comparing here. I'm taking the sales from the income statement and I'm comparing them against the net assets in the balance sheet. In other words, what I'm measuring is how much sales is generated by using the net assets in the operations. And of course, you want to generate as much sales as possible with as little net assets that are required to generate those sales. So typically you want this net asset turnover ratio, that's what NATO stands for in this context, to be as high as possible. As much sales with as little net assets as necessary. We could also explore this in a little bit more detail by asking ourselves how much sales is generated by using the fixed assets in the business and how much sales is generated by using the working capital in the business. And that's just a more granular look into the performance. So for now, I'm just positioning some of these ratios for you, giving you an idea of where the numbers come from. We will look at a specific business, specifically All-Star, because that's the one we've been working with, on how these ratios have meaning when we put some numbers to them. Right, so next up is to look at leverage. And leverage is a very lorny word that is really just asking about the amount of debt in the business. So if we want to look at the debt in the business, of course we must come here to the finance or the capital side of the balance sheet, and we must ask ourselves, how much debt do we have in relation to the total capital? So that's a very, very simple formula. Here we're going to take the debt divided by the total capital, often referred to as the debt ratio, and we're going to work that out as a percentage. Now we might also say, well, what's the debt in relation to the equity? Debt to equity ratio. That's another way that we can look at this. We can also say, well, what's the total capital in relation to the equity? So you see there are many different ways at which we can measure how much debt there is in the business. And it's really a preference. Depends on how you want to interrogate the debt. And when we do the numbers for All-Star, you'll see why it's important perhaps to look at this in different context. So that's a quick overview of some ratio theory and some formulas that we're going to use. In the next video, we're going to put these into practice in the All-Star business.